here. There will be many resource persons here, which include colleagues like Anjana, Bilal, etc. So thanks to Radhi sir for organizing this discussion. So before I move to the specifics of this particular litigation, I also want all of you to undertake a very short survey. So this should not take you more than 2 minutes to complete. So either you can type in the web address which I have put in there, or you can just scan this QR code and then provide your answers to those four very short questions. So very easy to answer. So can you just do it in 2 minutes? So it's bit.ly/CUSAT-KF, KF for Knowledge Forum. And I'll tell you the reason why I'm doing this survey in a minute. So there is a specific reason for doing this, but yes. I'm also putting that on the chat box so that those who are accessing this from the computer can just directly go to that link. Just a second. Yeah. Okay, I see that around 20 people have responded. But yes, I request the remaining participants also to respond to those questions. So what I can generally see from the 20 responses is that the vast majority of your postgraduate students. There are also a couple of assistant professors as well as guest faculty from CUSAT. With respect to the second question, that is, how satisfied are you with the availability of resources at CUSAT Library, including digital databases subscribed by CUSAT Library for conducting your research at CUSAT? Around 45% have said that you are somewhat satisfied, whereas like around 15% is saying not so satisfied. Then comes, I think, the more interesting question, that is, have you ever used Sci-Hub for your research? There I'm clearly seeing that 50% of you have used Sci-Hub for your research. With respect to LibGen, it's only, I think, coming to around 35%. But of course, when more and more of you respond, the percentage might vary. So maybe I can later also circulate this particular data set through Radhi sir, so that you can also have a look at the final data. But the broader reason why I thought I should do this particular survey is to illustrate two things. One, we need to ask ourselves whether we are having enough opportunities in the present context to access all the knowledge resources which we need for our education or research. Uh, I must say that, I mean, again, the data might change once all of you respond. I was a bit surprised by the fact that a substantial segment of you said yes, somewhat okay. My expectation was most of you would say it is not really sufficient. So it could be for two reasons. One might be the reason that a substantial segment of the respondents are postgraduate students, wherein I think the research requirements might be slightly limited. So if I think further restrict the sample to doctoral researchers or postdoctoral researchers, I'm sure that the answer would have been very, very different. And I think the most of the students would have said that the resources which are currently available university library, which includes electronic databases, are not really sufficient for completing our research in a meaningful manner. With respect to the familiarity of SciHub, yes, it's quite evident that at least 50% of you are using SciHub, which is also an indicator that yes, access through legitimate platforms are not really sufficient. With respect to LibGen, I see that the popularity is not that high. That's also due to the lack of awareness about LibGen as a source. So we'll be seeing in a couple of minutes what LibGen is and what they can also offer you in terms of your research. But the general point which I wanted to convey, and this was also arising from one of the things which Teddy sir mentioned when he invited me, was that when he, I think, discussed about the Sci-Hub litigation with many of you, and when I think he asked whether you would be interested in signing on a petition which would demand a more balanced approach from the side of the court, I had the first response was, isn't Sci-Hub illegal and should we really support an illegal activity? So through this short survey, I just wanted to illustrate that yes, technically some of the things which Sci-Hub or LibGen or any of the other websites might be doing might be illegal from a strict sense of law, but they may not be a completely unethical thing. So when you or I, again, I also re-emphasize, I also access all these websites for my research. When we access it for our research or for our education or for our general knowledge enhancing purpose, we might be breaking the law at certain times, but not at all times. But in no case, we might be engaging in an unethical activity. And why I am saying so, maybe we'll see in a couple of minutes. So before that, let's also look at who are the plaintiffs in this particular litigation. So there are three plaintiffs in this particular litigation. So the first one is a publication giant Elsevier, which publishes more than 2,500 journals, and this includes many prestigious journals like the Lancet. So Elsevier is the first one. Second is also another publication major called Wiley, which again I think publishes thousands of journals, and they also publish many books. And then the American Chemical Society is also one of the plaintiffs in this particular litigation. For your purpose, it is very, very important to know that these three publishers together control almost 40% of scientific publications in the world. In other words, it is these three publishers who determine how much access we should have to scientific literature in this world. So that's something which you all need to be aware of. Then let's also look at the defendants in this particular case. So there are around, I think, 12 or 14 defendants in this particular case. So the first defendant is the lady whom you are seeing on the screen, Alexandria Elbakyan. Not many people know about her current physical location, or even I think most of people know that she's from some part of former Russia, USSR, but the exact locations are not really known. But why we should know about her? because she is the founder of Sci-Hub. So she is the one who revolutionized access to millions of scientific papers. I think some estimates suggest that there are around 84 million scientific papers today available through Sci-Hub. So she's the one who hacked into different databases and made many of these articles available for people across the world. So she is put as the first defendant in this particular case. The second defendant is LibGen, but here no one is actually aware of who are the founders or who are the people who are working behind the website LibGen. So what LibGen does is, so if you need any book, there is a very, very high probability that it is available on LibGen. So Reddy sir mentioned that is, I have published 2 books, out of which at least one of them is available on LibGen for free download. So if anyone wants to read that particular book, I generally tell them, yeah, just go to LibGen, put that title, and you will be able to download it from one of the mirror sites or mirror servers which they have actually provided. So as you can imagine, yes, these works are not shared by the publisher. For example, in this particular example, the work was published by the Cambridge University Press, but it's not Cambridge University Press who is actually making this available. Some smart person in some part of this world might have scanned the particular book or downloaded the digital version of the book, and then she or he made available this particular book for people across the world. So it is like maybe thousands of unknown users and uploaders who are actually enabling people to access all these kinds of books for people across the world. And since the name or the other details of the founders of LibGen are not available in the public domain, the plaintiffs couldn't mention them specifically, so they just said, or they just made a list of different LibGen websites. So what is happening in the context of both Sci-Hub as well as LibGen is that plaintiffs like this have filed copyright infringement suits against them in different jurisdictions, and many times the court will issue an injunction against a particular website. So there might be an injunction which is preventing access to libgen.rs in a particular country, but then what the founder of LibGen will be doing is they will create a new domain name and then again make the same contents available for the broader public. So what the plaintiffs in this particular case did was they put a list of such domains to ensure that yes, they can be blocked. So they have been, the list of websites have been put as a list of defendants in this particular regard. Then defendants, I think 3 to 12 are different internet service providers like Airtel, Vodafone, etc., Jio, etc., who are providing internet access to you and me. The reason why they have been put as defendants is if the court is issuing a verdict in favor of the plaintiffs, they should be able to enforce that particular verdict, and the best thing to do will be to put specific instructions to these ISPs to block access to these domains. So that's the reason why around 8 or 10 ISPs have been put as a defendant. Then the Department of Telecom as well as the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology have also been implicated as defendants there, because the plaintiffs are saying that they also want these authorities, these government authorities, to issue an instruction to the ISPs asking them to block access to Sci-Hub as well as LibGen. So these are the defendants who have been mentioned in this particular litigation. So if you look at the question of what the plaintiffs are seeking in this particular case, what they are seeking is a blanket ban on access to Sci-Hub as well as LibGen. So what they are using is a tool which was innovated by the Delhi High Court in a decision that came in 2019. The case is UTV case. So I see that there are many scholars from IUC APRS who are attending this particular session. So one of you could possibly put a link to that litigation and the decision on the chat box so that others can also read it. So in that particular case, what was happening was, yes, we all know there are substantial amount of copyright infringements happening with respect to movies. So different people were creating different domains for disseminating links to copyright infringing movies. So in this particular case, when UTV made a copyright infringement application before infringement suit before the Delhi High Court, the court said that, okay, we are going to grant injunction in your favor, and you don't have to come back to the judges every time a new domain is coming up. So all what you need to do is you can just approach the deputy registrar of the court and tell them, okay, these are the new domains that have come up which are giving exactly the same content, and then the registrar will extend the injunction order to the new domains also, which in effect means no matter how many new domains you come up with, all of them will get quickly blocked through the extension of the injunction. But this is a very, very problematic type of injunction, particularly because there is no judicial oversight exercise. So the deputy registrar in his administrative capacity will be checking whether, okay, this domain is more or less sharing the same contents which the other domains were doing, and then she or he will be blocking the access to those new domains. And generally, most of the copyright scholars would say that this is not the way to issue injunctions, because there are serious consequences on different fundamental rights, including freedom of speech and expression. So if there are no sufficient judicial oversight, there can be serious harm to public interest, and so generally dynamic injunctions should not be issued. But in this particular case, relying on that particular UTV decision, the plaintiffs are saying or arguing that a dynamic injunction should also be issued against both Sci-Hub as well as LibGen, so that the access to Sci-Hub and LibGen can be completely blocked in India. Here, if you look at the major arguments made by the plaintiffs, you will notice that they gave the court an illustrative list of articles and so on where they hold copyright. And then without looking at any of the counter arguments, what they have done is they have told the judge, see, we are the copyright holders in millions of articles, and websites like Sci-Hub and LibGen are engaging in copyright infringement. So please issue an dynamic injunction. And they also make the argument that things like the IP policy, national IPR policy formulated by the Indian government is generally saying that infringements should be prevented. And this would, if there is mass infringements happening, then it would be affecting their incentives to publish good scholarly literature. So these are the major arguments made by the plaintiffs in this particular regard, and they are seeking dynamic injunction. So now the core question is whether a court should issue a dynamic injunction. So when the matter came before the court on 24 December, the court heard the plaintiff's counsel in detail, and then one lawyer also appeared on behalf of Alexandria. So we still do not know whether Alexandria has made a final decision on defending herself in a court of law in India, because if you look at litigations that have happened in other jurisdictions, you will notice that Alexandria didn't appear in those jurisdictions. So we do not know what will be the final position taken by her. But at least there was one young lawyer who tried to appear on behalf of her. And after hearing both of them, the court has now issued an injunction order which says that Sci-Hub should not upload any new contents or share any new contents through the Sci-Hub website. So similar thing has been said about the LibGen website also. So a dynamic injunction hasn't been issued yet, but there is a very, very high probability that if the publishers manage to convince the court that an injunction is absolutely deserved in this case, maybe the court might follow the ratio in UTV decision and issue a dynamic injunction. So it is at this stage, we as students, we as researchers need to ask ourselves what are the potential consequences of a dynamic injunction. And if we are aware of the potential consequences, maybe we will also be able to convince the judges on why we should not issue a dynamic injunction in this particular case. So the most important consequence, as you can all imagine, is on one fine morning, India will be completely losing access to the literature which are currently shared through Sci-Hub and LibGen. And as you can imagine, that might also mean the end of research for many researchers across the country. If you look at even the most privileged institutions in India, for example, I think IIC receives the highest amount of funding in natural science, if I understand correctly. Even in IIC, today they don't have subscription to all the journals published in the world. In other words, if not even the best library in the country cannot give access to all the literature which the researchers and students in this country need, and if our access to sources like Sci-Hub or any of the similar websites are blocked on one fine morning, we can imagine what would be the consequence for research and innovation in India. I think that would be the end of it. And as most of you might have also learned from the last couple of months, wherein, like me, most of you might also be working and doing your research from home. Even for libraries with subscription to journals, the remote access is very, very limited. So most of the publishers are very, very reluctant in giving remote access to the content subscribed by a university, which in effect means we won't even be able to access all the literature to which our university has subscription. Again, think about the broader consequence. To me, at least as a researcher, that's going to be a very, very grave consequence and a very undesirable consequence, to say the least. So already we are seeing enormous amount of inequality in access to resources. But if on a fine morning, if our own court is going to issue an injunction against a website like Sci-Hub or LibGen, or for that matter, any other website that shares academic literature, that's gonna further perpetuate and exacerbate the inequalities that exist in this world. And that's certainly an undesirable result, and we as a community need to prevent it. If you look at the current pricing model, you will also realize that subscribing separately to the journals which you might want is also not a viable option. The example which I have put here is that of Lancet, which many of our medical professionals rely on. So just when this particular litigation was happening, when the buyer asked me whether I can write a piece on this particular litigation, I was quickly searching on what is the current pricing model of the Lancet. So Lancet is saying, okay, if your institution is not having subscription to Lancet, you have a wonderful opportunity to buy access to Lancet. And that wonderful opportunity is for 24 hours, they will be only charging $32. And that's for one article and just for 24 hours. Tell me how many of the 40 people who are attending this particular session will be able to afford to buy articles in this pricing model. Of course, I can completely put in writing that none of you will be able to do your research, either doctoral research or even a master's dissertation, by accessing one article, right? You might want to access 100 articles, if not like maybe 500 different articles to write on any particular topic if you really want to make a substantial contribution. And if that is the case, do you really think this is an alternate model viable for researchers in India? But this is precisely what the publishers want. So they want us to shift to this pricing model, wherein if your institution cannot buy subscription, then you have to pay and get the subscription. And the charges which they are charging today are at this level. So this $32 is at the lower level. If you look at many of the other journals, the prices even go higher. So that's also something which you need to keep in mind. If you want to think about the injustices which we might be giving to the publishers through infringement, maybe we should also think about what is the current model which is being followed by publishers. Many of you visit restaurants, right? But do you generally take your own raw materials and go to a restaurant and then pay the restaurant for cooking the materials which you brought in and then eat there? Generally, no, right? Of course, there are certain fancy restaurants like this in some parts of the world. Of course, people also want to explain different case areas. So the picture which you are seeing is one of those IKEA restaurants wherein you can actually take your materials and then cook yourself. But if you look at the academic publishing model, it is following something similar. Take any of the academic research articles which you have published and ask yourself who has done the most of the work. So of course, you are the one who wrote the article, which means all the efforts as well as the time, as well as the money involved were coming from your side or from the side of your institution or the funding agency. Then yes, once you submit the article to a journal, like say for example, the Lancet, they will be sending it for peer reviewing. And generally, who are these peer reviewers? They are also your own colleagues who might be working in different parts of the world. And generally, they don't get even a single penny for the peer review process. So that means at both the levels, there is no payment happening from the side of publishers. Then the third is, yes, once the peer review is over, once you incorporate all the suggestions from peer reviewer, yes, it goes into typesetting. Traditionally, publishers used to incur at least some amount of money there because most of the people were sending written transcripts, and then yes, someone will have to type in them and do the proper typesetting. But in today's world, most of the journals, if you have made even a single submission for any journal, you will know that they all ask you to submit in specific formatting, conforming to specific guidelines on how to even footnote references, right? Which in effect means even with respect to typesetting, today hardly any expenditure is happening from the side of the publishers. And finally, when it comes to the dissemination of the final typeset version, traditionally people were, or the publishers had to print the material and then disseminate it. But some of the recent statistics says that for most of these publishers, including the three plaintiffs here, the print subscription is constituting only around 10%, which means for the 90%, the cost of dissemination is only that of the internet cost. Which in effect means publishers are making money without spending any amount or an insignificant amount of money from their side. All the efforts, both in terms, all the time, all the money are actually going in from the side of the researchers or the funding agencies or their educational institution. And if you look at the revenue, the profit revenues of most of these publishers, you will notice that most of them are at 30% plus. And there are not many industries in this world that would provide you 30% plus margin in a business. I don't think the oil industry is giving it. I don't even think the drug peddlers, which many of you might be familiar with, may be earning 30% of profit margin. Do we really want to support an injunction for a set of people who are following this kind of an exploitative business model? I think that's one fundamental question which we as researchers need to ask, and which we as researchers also need to communicate to the judges who will be adjudicating an issue like this. Unfortunately, if you look at the plaint, there is no mention about either the cost involved by the publishers nor the losses which they are actually incurring because of infringements that are happening from the side of you and me. So that's something which you need to be very, very careful about. So in my view, this is one of the classical cases where the public interest very, very clearly says that a dynamic injunction should never ever be granted. So the maximum a court should do is put the matter into full trial, let both the sides argue the cases on merit, let them produce evidences, and then on a case-to-case basis, the court can determine whether Article X is infringing or the rights in the copyright in Article X or Y or Z has been infringed. If you issue a dynamic injunction, that would be clearly against public interest. In this context, I must also add one more aspect, that is, if you look at websites like Sci-Hub, you might have also realized that not all the materials on Sci-Hub or LibGen are copyrighted materials. So some of those materials might have been out of copyright protection because the copyright term expired. Some of them are materials wherein copyright cannot exist. So all these factors need to be also looked into in detail by the court before issuing an injunction. But as we can see from the preliminary injunction which the court issued, most of the judges are not aware about the intricacies in this particular regard. So as a community, yes, we need to mobilize ourselves and we need to convince the court as well as the public why this litigation is not against Sci-Hub but against the research community in India. And if we can mobilize the public opinion in this regard, I'm sure that the judges will also take a more balanced approach in this particular regard. So in this context, I must also add that, yes, I do not know what would be the final result in this particular litigation, but we should also be prepared for alternative scenarios. So one of the things, if this injunction is failing, one of the things which we as a community need to do is to make our parliamentarians also aware of the fact that copyright in academic works is problematic. There have been many articles which have examined the desirability of copyright in academic works, and the one which you see on the screen is one of the seminal articles in this regard, wherein Professor Stephen Schavel, who is a professor at Harvard, has argued that copyright in academic works need to be completely abolished. So that's a best case scenario. Of course, it's not a very easy thing to happen because there are certain international agreements that exist in the realm of copyright. And maybe we might have to take efforts at the international level to make even changes at the domestic level. But maybe in the long run, this is one of the things which we need to keep in mind and which we also need to very clearly tell the publishers. The other thing which I also want to specifically mention is that we as researchers also need to embrace open access. So there are different kinds of open access models existing today. The least controversial one is a so-called green open access route, wherein you as a researcher has a right to share the post-print version of your manuscript in any research repository. which you would like to share to. For example, I think CUSAT has a repository, a university level repository. And so if you have written an article on any issue, and if you want to submit it to a journal, that's absolutely fine. Submit it to any journal which you want, but submit the final accepted version of the manuscript in the repository and make them available for people across the world. I think that's something which every researcher can do and which every researcher should do. So that's a green open access route. So archiving, one of the postprints. The other option would be to try to publish in an open access journal. Of course, I understand that not all fields have good open access journals, and there are also some disciplines wherein the open access journals charge article processing charges, so don't pay article processing charges. That's not something which I would ever recommend. But one of the things which we should always try to do as a community is to evolve journals which are open access. So wherein the final versions of the published articles can be accessed by anyone across the world without any fee. So that's something which we as researchers should actually try to do. But if I look at the data on open access in India, I must say that the current situation is very, very disappointing. For example, as part of the Open Science survey, which we conducted in 2017, we had also asked researchers how many of them rely on materials which are available through openly, and most of the people said they rely on materials which are available openly. But then when we ask them how many of them share their materials through an open access repository, be it the publications or be it data, only very, very few set of people were actually seen sharing their publications or data through an open access repository. So we are all happy in taking things from others, but when it comes to sharing our research results, be it publications or be it research data, we are not very much enthusiastic. So I think that's also something which we need to change. In some of the disciplines like physics, we are seeing some promising developments, more people are sharing. But in most of the other disciplines, including my good colleagues and friends, economics, I see that most of our Indian researchers are very, very reluctant to share their manuscripts or research data through an open access repository. So that's something which we need to keep in our mind. Last but not the least, we should also very, very clearly communicate to these exploitative publishers that if they are going to take an injunction on this matter, we might be using other tools within the copyright system to go against them. And the best available tool at the moment is compulsory licensing. So if a particular material is not available on reasonable terms, the statute is providing an option to approach the intellectual property appellate board seeking a compulsory licensing. In the history of copyright law in India, to the best of my knowledge, we haven't issued even a single compulsory licensing so far. But if these publishers are going to get an injunction against Sci-Hub or LibGen, one of the things which we all as researchers should do is file compulsory license applications against their databases, particularly requesting them, say for example, for ₹1 or whatever it might be. And we need to ensure that the IPAB issues a compulsory licensing on those databases. I am 100% sure that if there is a tangible threat of issue of compulsory licensing in India, none of these publishers will pursue their copyright infringement litigation in India. But unfortunately, today they are like overconfident that none of the researchers or universities in India will apply for a compulsory licensing. So, but if they are going to get an injunction in their favor, one of the things which you should do, which the CUSAT knowledge forum should maybe do, is to file compulsory licensing applications against the databases of LCO, Willy, and ACS. And I think that's the best you will be able to do for the community, so that at least other publishers will never ever endeavor in something similar. There is also a similar proposal that is statutory licensing, which is slightly different from compulsory licensing, wherein you just need to apply and then you get it. So, which would be a much smoother system. So, it is not currently existing in our copyright law, but if again the injunction is granted, maybe we should demand our parliamentarians to bring in a statutory licensing regime for academic works or databases. So, to summarize, what we need to do as students, as researchers today, is to one, tell ourselves that yes, some of the works in Sci-Hub might be infringing the copyright of these publishers, but when we are using those materials, we are not really engaging in an unethical activity. So that's the first thing which you and I need to realize at this particular point. Here, I must also add that if you look at the history of any of the developed countries, you will notice that all of them were very liberally allowing the use of copyrighted materials before they became developed countries. Germany is my favorite example in this regard. There have been empirical studies that show that the absence of copyright protection for a substantial period contributed to what Germany is today in both science as well as innovation. Other examples include USA, Japan, etc. China is another very recent example. So we don't need to feel shy about using copyrighted materials. I know that's the reason why most of you asked these are why we should, or whether it's a desirable thing to defend an illegal activity like Sci-Hub. I don't think there is any reason to be ashamed of that. Every country, every developed country in this world has done that. And if we are not going to defend sources like that, we will only be shooting on our own feet. That's something which we need to avoid. And as I mentioned in the last couple of minutes, we should also be prepared for alternative scenarios wherein maybe we might have to lobby before the parliamentarians for either abolishment of copyright in academic works or at least more of a grant of a statutory licensing regime for academic work. So with this, I would end my initial remarks. I know that I have taken more time than what I should have, but I am really keen on listening from all of you, particularly from my colleagues at IUC, IUCRS. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for such a crisp and providing a bird's overview over this topic. I have a question in the chat box. So maybe I'll pose it to you directly. So
Yes,
it's from Korea, from ISP department within CUSAT. In case the court verdicts in favor of the plaintiffs with a blanket ban, will accessing the websites via VPN or other methods be also considered illegal to the persons who try to access this?
of course. I mean, if you are accessing it through VPN or whatever it might be, yes, it's very hard to track your usage. So the chances of you getting caught are much lesser. That's what I think most of the people in China are doing to overcome the great internet wall of China. But again, I mean, you are still considered technically infringing the copyright in these works, or you are violating the order. But again, I re-emphasize, I think we shouldn't really think about a scenario wherein we all will have to rely on VPNs for accessing these websites, but I think we should rather try for a scenario wherein the court doesn't issue a dynamic injunction. Of course, I mean, that's a backup. VPN is certainly a backup option, but please don't try to rely on that, because most of our research, again, I mean, if I ask people who are attending this particular forum, I'm sure that the vast majority of them may not even be familiar with how VPNs work and which VPNs are actually good. And you also know there are many VPNs wherein security is a serious concern. Also, there are only very, very few VPNs wherein I think we can access contents without fearing that, okay, our own privacy will be at risk. So that's something which we need to be aware of. But yes, that's an option.
Yeah. So if there are any further questions, you can the participants can unmute their microphone and pose it directly to Dr. Arul.
Hello, good evening,
So
sir.
please don't be shy. There are no wrong questions here. So yeah, please.
Good evening, sir. I am Sulok and I'm from the IPR Center. Sir, my question is
Yes.
when we look at this litigation history of Elsevier against Sci-Hub, in many jurisdictions, they have already got many injunctions and successful victories. But there are so many reports coming that it is not even having any effect because the moment the court is granting injunction, they're coming with newer and newer mirror websites and all. So in India, even if they are having a positive judgment, even if Elsevier wins, do you see a different scenario in India considering the present state of law in the country?
So very good question. So one of the things which you should also look at is how many of the other jurisdictions have used a tool like dynamic injunction. In none of the other jurisdictions, they have got something similar to what UTV has managed to get in that particular decision. And that's the reason why I was very careful in saying that what should be our priority is avoiding a dynamic injunction, not an injunction. So if it's just an ordinary injunction, for example, with respect to 5 articles, 10 articles, whatever it might be, the specific links, then I don't think there will be any impact because the people behind SciHub and LibGen, as well as any other similar websites, will be able to create new domains and make the contents accessible for you and me. But if it's a dynamic injunction, the situation might be radically different because they just need to go to the joint registrar of the High Court and say that these are the 10 new domains that have come up, please block them also. And the experience suggests that yes, that process is much quicker because there is no judicial oversight involved, right? So the differences in what you have seen in other jurisdictions and here might be very, very drastic. So none of the other jurisdictions have taken that kind of a sweeping approach when it comes to granting injunctions. So that's something which we need to be careful about. That's also the reason why I said, see, let the matter go to full trial. So let the judges decide in what cases the particular content is infringing and what are the potential defenses to the defendants there. So let it go through a full trial and let the court issue specific injunctions rather than a dynamic injunction.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from the same participant. Can today be taken as a call for immediate action to write to our MPs regarding this issue? Can we
Yeah,
decide on an outcome
yeah.
right?
So one of the things which I think we all should try to do is we should make our representatives aware of the gravity of the issue. So even if we receive a setback in the court, we should be able to address this issue through a legislative route actually. So for example, I specifically mentioned the possibility of bringing in a statutory licensing provision, right? So let's convince our MPs what will be happening if a dynamic injunction is issued. And if a dynamic injunction is issued, one of the things which our MPs should take on a priority is one, debating on the desirability of copyright for academic work. So that's, I think, very, very essential. The second thing is specifically looking at the possibility of using the statutory licensing. I would also say that, see, if you look at the way compulsory licensing works, the particular thing, the decision to grant a compulsory licensing is issued by the Intellectual Property Appellate Board. These tribunals, if you look at the way they are actually working, the judges in this tribunal are appointed by the bureaucracy, right? So the bureaucracy still have a substantial influence on the decision-making process in the tribunals, and we should convince the tribunal that a compulsory license grant is very much desirable in a case like this. So writing to MPs is a great idea, and I would definitely encourage all of you to write to your MPs about this particular matter. Let them be aware of this issue and let them be aware of the potential consequence of an injunction.
Thank you, sir. Moving on to the next question from Akhilendra Patel. Whether it will come within the ambit of fair dealing because they are not commercializing the database?
So again, we will have to look at these issues on a case-to-case basis. So there cannot be a blanket fair dealing exception to what Sci-Hub is doing. That's a very clear thing. But on the other hand, if you as a researcher, if Akhilendra as a researcher is downloading one article, and if these guys are suing you for copyright infringement, you would definitely be able to make a strong case of fair dealing exception. So in the fair dealing exception, the analysis happens on a step-by-step process. So the first question is whether the particular the use of the work for a purpose specifically mentioned in the statute, and this research and private study is specifically mentioned there. So that aspect is very clear. The other question, and the most challenging question, is whether the dealing was fair. And there the courts will have to look at different factors, and only one of them is the question of whether you are commercializing it or not. But there are also other factors, like, for example, to what extent you use that work, etc. So it's not very easy to predict the outcome of the use of the fair dealing exception provision. You will have to test it on a case-by-case basis. In general, so my recommendation would be, it's a bit too risky to take that route unless they are initiating an infringement suit against you as an individual. So if they are initiating an litigation against you as an individual for using contents you access through Sci-Hub, you have a much stronger case. But Sci-Hub as such may not be able to make much use of the fair dealing exception. At least that's my reading of the exceptions. But of course, my colleagues at IUC-IPRS will definitely also be able to provide more insights on this. Anyone wants to add to those observations? Anjana, do you have a different point of view on that? Anjana, and I think who else is there? I'm just looking at the
No,
list.
I agree with you.
Okay. I think Vishnu is also there. Vishnu, would you disagree with me on this, the fair dealing argument?
No, sir.
Yeah, so the general, the point is, I mean, fair dealing might be a bit too risky route to take in this particular regard, except if they are suing you as an individual infringer.
Hello, sir. I'm Naveen from IPR Center. I have a question, sir.
Yes, Naveen.
Sir, you had suggested a way to decrease the over dependency on these journals, but like in a practical situation where we judge the quality of a publication based on the journal where it is published, and also looking at it as a way of identifying a good article. So how far can we lessen this dependency on these journals? I also am interested and also believe that, as you said, it is better to contribute an article to open source databases. But in this scenario, in this real scenario, how far it is workable? Such a
very good question, Naveen. So there are two things there. So one, you are absolutely right that in the current academic or research assessment system, we are over relying on the reputation or the impact factor of a journal. So that's a reality today. But having said that, over the last couple of years, particularly in the last 5 years, there has been an increasing consensus among the research community that maybe it's a bad idea to rely on reputation or the impact factor or any other similar metrics. And that's for two reasons. One, publication in a particular journal in no manner conveys the quality of a journal. Of course, I mean, we all think that all articles published in Nature, for example, are really amazing articles. But then you all should also know that many articles that were published in Nature have also been retracted, which means there are quality issues even on these particular journals. The second issue, which is also I think a broader issue, is that it is the same set of publishers who are today controlling these metrics also. So for example, if you look at the way most of these journal rankings are done today, just check who is actually controlling these infrastructure. So most of them are, for example, today controlled by Thomson Reuters or publishers like Elsevier. And do we really want to further add to their business model by legitimizing that? I don't really think so. So what we definitely need to do as a research community is to convince our policymakers that what should really matter is what you publish rather than where you publish. This, of course, requires substantial amount of convincing our current research and academic leadership, because, for example, even if you look at the NIRF rankings, or even if you look at our own this API points, because if, for example, any of the teachers want to get promotion, they use the API scores, right? They all rely heavily on this existing system, which is put in by these publishers, and we definitely have to move away from that. So there are certain positive signs emerging in this regard through discussions among the research community, and in the Indian context, the principal scientific advisor to the Prime Minister has openly mentioned that he is very much in support of the importance of what you publish rather than where you publish. And I'm truly hoping that in the coming days, we might see some policy changes in this regard. But as it stands today, you are absolutely right. We rely heavily on the reputation or the impact factor of the journal. And that's a precise reason why these people are able to put that exploitative model or exploitative burden on all of us. And sorry, just one more final thing, because you mentioned about the open access databases. So during my initial remarks, I also specifically mentioned there are two paths to open access: green open access and gold open access model. In the green open access model, what you are doing is only submitting a final accepted version of your manuscript in a database. And in general, most of the publishers allow you to submit that version of your manuscript. So by final accepted means once you submit the article, it goes for peer reviewing. After peer reviewing, you will also incorporating those suggestions. So that version, that final accepted version can be put in an institutional repository, and most of the publishers generally allow it. But in spite of the publishers allowing it, most of our researchers are not doing it. And that's the reason why I said in the current scenario wherein people rely heavily on the impact factor or the reputation of the journal, the minimum we should do is yes, putting a final accepted version in a repository which anyone can access. And if the journal is not allowing it, please assert your rights in this particular regard, because that is your right as an author. That's something which you need to keep in mind.
Sir, is ResearchGate such a forum?
So that's a good question. So there have been some litigations initiated by these publishers against platforms like ResearchGate. The most safest thing to do would be to put it in an institutional repository. For example, if CUSAT is having a repository, I think the best idea would be to put it in on the institutional repository. But if CUSAT doesn't have an institutional repository, then yes, I think maybe we should go for field-specific repositories. So in physics, people put it on Archive, ARXIV, Archive. And in, I think, agriculture, yes, they have Agri Archive. In law, we don't have a similar thing, so most of the people will be putting it on SSRN. In economics also, I think many people are putting it on SSRN. So like that, maybe yes, we can go for something like an institutional repository or also any of the common repository. But one of the bad things that is happening with many of these repositories is that these publishers are even taking over them. For example, now SSRN is controlled or taken over by Elsevier. So we need to be a bit careful about that, and that's the reason why I would always encourage people to put it in an institutional repository, and also persuade your institute to make it an interoperable repository. So as part of the upcoming science, technology and innovation policy, so I was one of the members of a committee constituted by the principal scientific advisor there. So one of the recommendations which we very specifically put in was there should be a mandate on every researcher who has been funded by the public to put a copy either in the institutional repository or a national repository which the government might create. And these will be interoperable repositories, and I think that would address this particular issue. Then we won't have to rely on private repositories like ResearchGate or SSR.
Thank you, sir. I think there are no further questions. I'll request Anjana Girish to kindly propose a vote of thanks.
Respected resource person for the session, my colleagues and dear students, my duty is to deliver the vote of thanks. As always, a presentation by Arul sir was dynamic, I must say, and sir has left no stone unturned in analyzing the issues which may arise at present as well as in the future to the research community in India if such websites are blocked. And he was very right in pointing out the repercussions that such litigations will have on us, that is, the research scholars, teachers, or to anyone involved in any kind of research. And I'm pretty sure that Sir was successful in making the students and the research scholars of CUSAT aware that this is an area which requires continuous and urgent deliberations from the part of the academic community in India, keeping in mind our research potential. So on behalf of IUCIPRS and all those present here, sir, I express my heartfelt gratitude towards you.
Thanks, Anjana, and all the people who participated in today's discussion. And if there are any further questions, please also feel free to reach out by email. And also make sure that, yes, you put pressure on the colleagues at IUCIPRS to take more initiatives in this particular regard. Thank you all.
Sure, sir. Sure. Thank you, sir. Okay. Thanks a lot. Now signing off.
Thank you.